Hello, my name is John Smithin, and I'm the executive co-director of the Aurora Philosophy Institute here in Aurora, Ontario, Canada. And with me, as usual, is Ronen Grunberg, Vice President Technology of the API and the original founder of the Tuesday Philosophy Club in Aurora, which was the forerunner of our institute. Last time, Ronan, we discussed virtue ethics, which is associated with Aristotle in classical Greece. But that idea is not very popular in the modern world, unfortunately. So today, I think we should move on to discuss some of these more modern approaches. I've therefore called this session When Virtue Falls from Her Heights. And that's a famous quote from somewhere, but I can't recall where just at this point in time. Anyway, how do you like that? I suppose that the problem is that the modern world is just not very virtuous at all.
Well, John, I'm not sure that the modern world is not virtuous, but I would say that there has definitely been a decline in the use of virtue ethics, the Aristotelian ideas, in contemporary discussions and in contemporary ethics. Basically, ethics has changed over the last couple of 100 years. The way we basically think about moral values and moral philosophies, and we've moved into ideas like consequentialism and deontology. And if you think about it, that's probably because we live in a much more complex world, and maybe we need to have more diverse ethical frameworks. Now, you may disagree with that. We're going to talk a little bit about that in the next little while. But one thing that is absolute is that virtue ethics, discussions around virtue and virtue ethics are still important. And these concepts are important to an understanding of what is integrity and what it means to be empathetic. So this is something that we are going to talk about. And I would agree with you, though, that virtue ethics has definitely declined, and it's moved into other things.
So last time, Ronan, thanks for last time. One of the discussants brought up the question of religion, and that made me think that we could categorize the non-Aristotelian approaches maybe in four ways at a kind of minimum to cut through the confusion, if you like, a little bit, try to put some structure in it. So the first one, picking up on that idea of religion, I said, well, we can talk about things like religion. We can talk about things like duty, the Victorian idea of duty, and then things like Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. So the common thread there being that, in some sense, you're being told what your ethics should be, right? Mm-hmm. You and I, in a private conversation some time ago, we discussed the question of moral relativism. You know, the idea that there is no firm set of ethics or no firm conducts of behavior. It just depends on your culture or, your individual desires. Mm-hmm. And you expressed some concerns about that. So maybe we can treat that as one category as well. And then there were two things which we did touch on a little bit last time. The first was this notion of equality, which seems sort of almost overwhelming in the contemporary culture. We mentioned last time that a lot of this can be traced back to John Rawls, the philosopher John Rawls' famous book, The Theory of Justice. So that, this meme, if you want to put it that way, of equality is ubiquitous in the modern world, that the idea is equality, literal equality. And then there's another set of things which we gave the expression, social justice, or we mentioned political correctness. These all mean much the same kind of thing. These days, there's this catchphrase, diversity, equity, inclusion. There's also this notion of, quote, wokeness. So these things, these slogans, if you want, change like all the time, but mm-hmm. they all sort of give a connotation of roughly the same kind of thing. So if we have those four broad categories of types of ethic, maybe we can, discuss each of these in turn. So shall we start with that sort of religion, imperative, duty kind of nexus?
Yeah. Okay. So let's start with Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative, and then we'll move on to religion. So when I was in university, I was crazy enough to actually suggest to one of my professors that I would do an essay on Kant's groundwork of the metaphysics of morals, where I became familiar with the categorical imperative. And I would say that it's not an easy read and it's not an easy philosophy, but I actually found it intriguing. And one of the things that I really appreciated with Kant is the idea of duty. I think that in our culture we don't really buy into it. But I would just like to very quickly flesh out Kant's categorical imperative. Essentially, what Kant is arguing is that any moral decision needs to transcend specific circumstances. And what Kant is saying is that the categorical imperative is a principle that allows you to universalize any action that you do. So if you can universalize an action without contradiction, then that action is reasonable. And what he argues is that you need to take an action that you're going to commit, and then you're going to have to ask yourself, can I will that this action will become a universal principle, that everyone can do this action without contradiction and without the loss of human dignity. One of the essential things that was important for Kant was the notion that individuals need to be treated as ends in themselves and not as a means to an end. He was very interested in preserving human dignity, and he demanded respect for autonomy. And ethical actions, Kant says, arise from rational deliberation. So you look at a situation, and then you have to rationally decide whether your action is a reasonable one. You can't just act according to your desires. So let me give you an example of the categorical imperative. Let's say, for example, that you're thinking that it's okay to lie to a friend to spare their feelings. They did something, or they bought something that you don't like, or they cut their hair a certain way. You don't think it looks good. You think, I'll just lie to them about it. So the thing that you need to do with Kant is universalize the maxim. Is it permissible to lie when it spares someone's feelings? So you need to assess that for contradictions, and you also have to think about how it's going to impact human dignity. Is it going to be a reasonable thing to do? Is it going to be in line with your duty to actually lie to your friend? So, one thing you might say, for example, is if I lie to my friend, I'm kind of manipulating their emotions, and I'm using them as a means to avoid discomfort for myself. You might also ask yourself, am I in some way undermining my friend's autonomy by denying them the truth? Do they deserve to actually have the truth, as uncomfortable as it is? So after you deliberate on it for a while, then you have to reflect on whether lying to your friend is something that you can universalize. Is it going to be in alignment with the principle of treating others with respect and dignity? And then you have to make a decision whether telling the truth, despite potential discomfort, is a moral duty. So you have to make that decision. So Kant would say that you have to use your rational thinking to come up with what is your duty. So that's the Kantian notion of duty. Now we of course have another way of thinking of duty, and that's the duty that's imposed through the Ten Commandments, and it's very different from Kant's, but it's also a duty-based moral system. And I think that you wanted to say a few things about the Ten Commandments.
Yes, well, I would like to explore this notion of religious dictates a little further. And the next slide that we have shows Moses and the tablets. Let's go to the source. And then we list the actual Ten Commandments in the English version from the ubiquitous King James Bible. So we have Moses and the tablets, and then the Ten Commandments in their in the English of of the 17th century, the early 17th century. So I've highlighted some of the points to which I want to draw attention. The first one that strikes me, perhaps unlike the categorical imperative that you were just talking about, is that it's all very negative. It's thou shalt not, right? Whereas when we were talking about virtue ethics, it was more what you should do, not what you shouldn't do. So that's just a relatively obvious point. One thing that really struck me when looking at these actual Ten Commandments as they appeared in the King James was the sixth commandment says, "Thou shalt not kill." Mm-hmm. I've perhaps not been a very diligent biblical scholar all these years, but I had assumed that it said, "Thou shalt not commit murder," and "thou shalt not kill." For one thing, it flies totally in the face of the original Bible, in which smiting thy enemy was top of the list of things to do, if you know what I mean. But more deeply, it doesn't make sense to have a blanket "thou shalt not kill," or at least it seems to me. Suppose you're acting in self-defense. Suppose you're a soldier in a declared war, and then it's your duty to kill. We don't even have to go there with thorny questions such as abortion, for example. So it just struck, I was actually shocked to see this blanket "thou shalt not kill," because I'd assumed it was much more nuanced. That the rule would be "thou shalt not commit murder," and then you would define what murder is, i.e., in some sense, legitimate killing from illegitimate killing. So that was interesting. Then the next thing, the third thing that leapt out at me was the 10th commandment said, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's manservant and maidservant." In short, the manservant and the maidservant are treated as property. So slavery is okay in the Ten Commandments? These things, I think we do need to unpack a little bit more before we obey the Ten Commandments. So one thing, Ronen, I want to ask you, do you understand Hebrew? I presume that you do, right?
I understand Hebrew a little bit. I'm not perfect at it, but yes, I do have some background in Hebrew.
So what would be interesting to me, never mind the King James, what was said in the original Hebrew? Did they say "thou shalt not kill," or did they say "thou shalt not commit murder"? And so I would find that really interesting. And then also, what about this slavery issue? Mm-hmm. So slavery is good in this particular code of ethics, or allowable in this particular code of ethics? What do you think?
Okay, so let's start with "thou shalt not kill." So the original Hebrew, it's a bit of a mistranslation. In the original Hebrew, the words are "lo tirtzach." That's the Hebrew word for kill, and tirtzach could be used as a way of describing murder or killing. So it does translate to "not kill," but what I think the commandment is actually referring to is intentional and unlawful taking of human life. That's what it's really looking at. And that is the scope of the commandment. It basically prohibits unjust and malicious killing, not all forms of killing. For example, it would be reasonable to kill for self-defense. In a wartime situation, it's reasonable to kill. So the underlying message is not that all killing is bad, but that certain types of killing, unlawful killing, is bad. And the reason why the word is ambiguous is because, of course, the language, the nuances in language are different in Hebrew versus English. And I think what they were trying to do is basically just use a very general word for killing, and include murder in that. Murder is bad, and you when you murder someone, you're killing them. So kill is a general word for taking of life. And maybe also, this is just something I'm speculating, the Christian tradition tries to avoid killing as much as possible. So the injunction is, try to avoid killing unless it is absolutely, absolutely, absolutely necessary. So that's why there's a general injunction around killing, but I think that the general emphasis is on lawful killing.
Yeah,
Now,
so Ronan, if I just come back to that, that's what I had thought. I had assumed that would be the common sense interpretation of it, and I kind of, without even thinking about it, I thought that must be there
yeah,
in the King James. So what you say about the original Torah, yeah, then that is much more consonant. But
yeah,
I would say then that, given that therefore this whole sort of Christian interpretation of it is to some extent gone completely wrong. Then no, completely. Let me withdraw that term, but it seems to have gone off on the wrong footing, sort of right from the start, if you know what I mean, and that may lead to a lot of peculiarities, given that we live in a sort of still in a Christian-dominated society. That leads to a lot of sort of peculiarities and anomalies. For example, pacifism, is very popular with some people, which in certain circumstances just is disastrous, right? So there's a lot in these translations of words, I
yeah.
guess, and it's kind of very dangerous, to pull things out of their cultural. Maybe that's pull things out of their cultural context. Maybe that's the same with this slavery thing.
Well, it is. I would just say, in terms of murder and killing, it is very important to consider it very carefully. Clearly, killing is not always a bad thing. It depends on the circumstances. And, even with virtue ethics, Aristotle would argue that it depends on circumstances. You can't always say, killing is bad, because there are circumstances where, killing may be necessary or may even achieve a good, depending on the situation. But that's a very provocative thing to say, and a lot of people may not agree with that at all. As far as the 10th commandment is concerned, I think that the general emphasis there is on coveting. It's an internal psychological sort of thing that is being denounced. Don't desire or envy others for what they have. So it lists things like, the house, the wife, the servants, etc., etc. But I think that one has to contextualize that historically. There is no specific endorsement or condemnation, as far as I know, in the Torah for slavery. However, I would say that the general gist of the commandments is that one should not hold human beings as objects, as property. There is a general sort of sense in which the Ten Commandments are promoting human dignity. So even though it doesn't specifically argue against having servants, I think the general gist of it is that having human beings as property is not a good thing. But of course, you have to think of these things in their historical context. It's dangerous to be anachronistic about it.
Yeah, I think that's maybe some of the things we've talked about today are a little bit sensitive, but that just stresses the point that ultimately you have to be sensitive to the original cultural historical context in which these ideas arose, and then adapt them, if you will, to your present day circumstances.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's move on to this question of moral relativism. I think you have some serious concerns about this particular tendency
Yeah.
in the modern world. Yeah.
I certainly do. I think we do live generally in a very morally relativistic world, and the general sort of approach is, you can pretty much do what you want, as long as you don't hurt other people. And everybody has the right to their own sort of moral and ethical perspectives. Now, traditional moral relativism basically argues that judgments and moral positions depend on cultural, societal, or individual perspectives, and that people can have different ideas of what is reasonable and what is just. And there are different types of moral relativism. There's like cultural relativism, where each culture has its own values. There's individual relativism, where values vary by individual beliefs. Now, the biggest problem for me, of course, is that moral relativism lacks an objective standard or an objective measure. It undermines certain moral standards. For example, how do you condemn actions like slavery, for example, if it's deemed acceptable within a cultural context? You may not agree with it in your culture, but what if another culture says, well, slavery is fine? If there are no moral standards by which you can measure the behavior of others, you can't really condemn their behavior. And that is, I think, one of the essential problems. Of course, the other thing is that relativism leads to inconsistent moral judgments. There is no way that you can actually have a conversation about it, because what are you going to discuss? I mean, you have your belief and I have my belief. There's nothing to actually talk about. And of course, the other problem is that what happens if there's a moral dilemma, if there's a moral question, where one needs guidance in a situation where there are conflicting moral values? How do you come up with a resolution? It's almost impossible, because both sides are going to be correct. And there's not going to be a third party that says, well, this side is right and that side is wrong, because both sides are going to say, well, what gives you the right to make that decision? So there are numerous, I think, problems with moral relativism, even though I would say that in our culture today, we live, in a moral relativistic kind of world, or at least a lot of people believe that that's the kind of world that we should live in.
But it seems to move, completely away from this notion of virtue. Going back to the point that that there are some kind of absolute standards or what have you.
Well, one of the things with moral relativism is that you don't have to argue for your position. All you have to say is, I believe that my position is the right one. You don't actually have to argue for it.
And surely, at a minimum, in a civilized society, there must be some attempt at argument or persuasion or whatever. Excuse me. So let's move on to the third theme about equality, and we've already mentioned this theme, or even meme, is extremely influential in today's society. And we mentioned that the intellectual underpinnings are found in the 1971 book by John Rawls, which was entitled A Theory of Justice. Now, in the next slide then, which we're going to see, there's a cartoon of Rawls, who apparently, if you look at the cartoon, wants to enforce this notion of equality on the rest of us quite aggressively. And actually, this is something I've found consistently in this notion of ethics. You know, when one comes up with a position of ethics, you try to enforce that your particular view on everybody else quite aggressively. And on the other hand, and this is something which strikes me as to be very true of quite a few of these professors in the United States. I don't remember any announcement about Rawls giving up his salary as a tenured professor at Harvard University for all those years. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't remember any commitment to that. But everyone else should give up their income, right? Kind of thing. Anyway, one point that I think we need to discuss there, because goes back to these ideas of what do we mean by justice, what do we mean by equality. I'm reminded of the old saying that you cannot judge a book by its cover. In this case, you cannot judge a book by its title. And the use of the term justice in particular seems to me to require comment, because traditionally, going back in these old cultures that we were talking about, traditionally justice was interpreted as implying that people should get what they deserve in some sense. Mm-hmm. Right? It did not necessarily mean that everybody should be equal, or that outcomes should be equal, or anything like that. But now, this notion that justice requires more or less equal shares for everybody, except for Harvard University professors, regardless of their deserts, is commonplace. Excuse me just a moment. So I guess that leads me to say that a better title for Rawls' book must have been something like A Theory of Equality, or better still, a justification, again, going back to that word, a justification for equality. So, Ronen, what do you say about Rawls? Certainly a very influential figure over this past half century.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot to unpack with Rawls, and given the time, I'm not going to get into too much detail with him, but I do think that Rawls' central notion of finding a just society using the concept of a veil of ignorance is an interesting one. I do think that some of the conclusions that he comes to are questionable, and some of the notions of distributive justice is very limiting. So I do think he's an interesting thinker. I think part of the problem with Rawls is that he is very theoretical, and I studied Rawls again in university when I took a course on him, and I just had a hard time getting my head around some of the ideas because they did seem very ethereal and very conceptual. And one of the questions that I had back then, and I still have, is how do you apply some of the concepts in a practical sort of world? How do you make them work? So there's a lot to unpack here, and he's an interesting thinker. I'm not going to just say he's worthless. He's not. I mean, he's an interesting thinker, and his interest in human dignity and in creating a more equal society is not totally unreasonable. But like you say, John, how about your success or what you achieve being measured with your the work that you do and your intellectual capacity or your capacity in general to succeed? What happens to that? I think that's one of the questions around Rawls. Anyway, interesting thinker. Maybe we can talk about him a little more in our discussion.
And last time we also mentioned a rather different idea of justice, so-called social justice. And here the emphasis is on the adjective rather than the traditional meaning of the noun. And there, justice is supposed to apply mainly to social groupings, such things as age, class, ethnicity, very importantly, gender, very importantly, national origin, physical disability, sexual orientation, religious affiliation, or, there's a myriad of collective attributes which you could divide people up by. And as we already mentioned, there are many similar ideas which have gained currency in the last half century and more with labels such as political correctness, intersectionality, wokeness, diversity, equity, inclusion, and so forth. Again, based on conversations that you and I have, I think you have some concerns with the way that the term social justice is usually interpreted. You have like a kind of a broader concept of social justice, and the way that it's interpreted today is of concern to you.
Yeah, so I think that for me the biggest issue is that the notion of justice is conflated with just being politically correct. That is an issue, and I think that it's really important to move towards respect and human dignity. That is very important, but I think it needs to be done without stifling open dialogue, without instilling fear of consequences for dissenting views. And I think that, unfortunately, I see too often we live in a culture today where social justice frameworks are oversimplified, and they essentially become power dynamics where people are portrayed as either oppressors or victims, and that is a problem, I think, and it restricts free speech. That's an issue. Free speech is tantamount. I mean, not completely free. Obviously, you have to be careful. There are certain things that you can't say. I mean, there are things that would be considered hate speech. You have to be very careful about. But I think that free speech, where arguments are made, where one tries to come up with an idea that is going to be workable for a society as a whole, and arrive at some truth. That kind of speech should not be stifled. Justice is not politics, and I think that we need to be cognizant of not making justice a political movement.
Going back to this virtue ethics, we started this by talking about a recent book by two academics, Rasmussen and Den Earl, which was called The Realist Turn. And what they argue for, I don't think they neglect issues of justice and equality. On the contrary, they argued that metaphysical realism that we discussed earlier was vital, both for arguing that individuals have basic negative natural rights, and for the opposite to the issue, the type of things we're discussing, a non-reductive, naturalistic account of human good, human perfectionism, individual perfectionism. So again, the bottom line of the virtue ethics is ethics is an individual thing. We're working on ourselves. To some extent, the common thread between these other things is that ethics is some kind of a collective thing, and it's somehow legitimate for other people to impose their view of ethics, as it were, on all of us. In short, by implication, the other approaches to ethics, the approaches that we're discussing today, do not do that. They do not provide for this path towards individual human flourishing. I'll leave you the last word, and I'll just mention that what we need to do next time, we've already begun to slide, have we not, from ethics into politics. We've already sort of made that transition in this slide. I think next time we have to then focus on the politics in a philosophical sense. What are the consequences of these ideas for politics and geopolitics and political economy? And we'll do that next time. I'll leave you with a final summary, Ronen.
Well, my final summary is that I agree that in order to have a viable ethical system, you always have to start from the individual. And it is about human flourishing. And it starts with personal reflection, and it can never be that's something that is dictated by an authority. I don't think any ethical system works that is a simple sort of thou shalt behave this way, because I think that reflection is very important. Even with the Ten Commandments, there's a certain reflection there. I mean, there's a lot of scholarship around what they mean. And I think that reflection is fundamental to any ethical system.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you. So thanks very much. Bye, everyone. See you next time.
Bye. Take care.